The message that I've been getting loud and clear and more strongly as time goes by is that it's time for him to go, and I agree.
Public and private calls for the Prime Minister to step down as party leader quickened the pulse of the Liberal caucus this week, and it had at least one cabinet minister in a fighting mood.
This is the most passive-aggressive, weak type of display of questioning of leadership that I've ever seen. The Prime Minister is colleagues with these individuals, if they are indeed in the numbers that are speculated to be. They owe it to him to go up and tell it to his face. At the end of the day, it makes this group of people look horribly entitled and worried about their own futures. Say it to your face. Let's clear it up and let's focus on the bigger threat, which is what we're currently doing, which is sleepwalking into a Pierre Poilievre win who is only focused on himself and doesn't really care about this country.
That's a pretty blunt analysis from Mark Miller. So are the Liberals headed for a major clash in caucus next week, or could the secret plotters back down? That's where we start with our political insiders. Greg McEachern is a former Liberal ministerial staffer, and here with me in the studio, Fred Delory is a former Conservative campaign manager, and Melanie Richer is a former communications director for the NDP. What a week. I'm going to say that, and next week I think I'm going to say that again. Greg, let's start with you. What's the latest you're hearing about the state of things inside the Liberal Party and inside the Liberal caucus? I have heard there's meetings going on to finalize the game plan rolling into next week. Where do you think this is?
So first of all, Politico's reporting today that the Liberals that are involved in this did not want this to become public. And again, it's Ottawa. Ottawa leaks like a sieve. But you and I had both heard last week following Wednesday's caucus and we were about 7 minutes into our panel last week when the Toronto Star story broke, and I know that you and your colleagues were working on one as well that came out not long after. So this was in the works. I think to Minister Miller's point about the entitlement, I agree with Mark on a lot of things. I'm not sure on this one. Maybe perhaps they were well-meaning in thinking that they would get to the Prime Minister before the media, but that's not the way Ottawa works. In terms of what to expect, trying to pin this down is like putting a thumbtack in Mercury. I've heard various things that there may be more than one letter, or one group or faction may be looking for some commitments or acknowledgements from the Prime Minister of changes that they've been asking for or expecting for a while. That could include advertising, it could include staff changes. And then I hear from other people and what we saw from Sean Casey, the MP from Charlottetown this week, where he bluntly said it was time for the Prime Minister to step down. And in terms of Mr. Casey, that surprised a lot of people. Sean Casey was not somebody that was known to be out there, stating this. So I think, Wednesday will probably be a really intense morning on Parliament Hill. A lot of media scrutiny on the caucus meetings and in the lead up. I'm not clear yet that there is one faction with one demand. But I will say, to push back on Mr. Miller a little bit, in that there have been expectations from the Prime Minister and from the PMO about what was going to change. They've been asking for that for a while. And again, I think the catalyst was the interview he did with Liberal MP Nathaniel Erskine-Smith, where he showed his thinking around advertising, the by-elections, and I'm told that was the one item that struck a nerve with caucus, where it actually showed his thinking.
Okay, it spooked a lot of people, is what I've heard in caucus. So Fred, the latest information I have, and look, you've all seen cabinet ministers on this show, they've heard about it, they know people who may be involved with it, they're not denying this is happening. It's a question of how big it is and how effective it might be. The latest I've heard is that close to 30 names are now on the initial document, which does have a clear common pledge of the Prime Minister has to go. They are now in the process of finalizing a letter of some sort that will go to the Prime Minister either before caucus or at caucus, codifying their clear demands. What's missing is a clear ultimatum, like what will we do? Will we sit as independents? Will we vote non-confidence? None of that's there, but we might see some activity between now and Wednesday as well to try to propel momentum on this. So the cabinet is pushing back, Fred, but they don't know what they're pushing back against, really, right? They don't know the size, the scale, the strength of it. What do you think happens?
It's a fascinating civil war erupting here. You know, Trudeau's now fighting a two-front war. He's against the Conservatives, who are pounding him every day, and now he's fighting his own caucus. Mark Miller, his comments were like calling his fellow Liberals entitled, and he's going to war with them, and that's what's breaking out here. And his comment about sleepwalking into something like what. The Liberals feel like they've been sleepwalking for the last few years. So what are they like? The Trudeau team needs to put something forth, some kind of plan, some kind of this is how we're going to do it. It feels like it may be way too late now. I don't know how you do this. And, I don't think you need an ultimatum other than 30 Liberal members of Parliament saying you need to go. That is going to be incredibly damaging as this continues to unfold over the next week or so.
Yeah, and look, when we were all here last week, I knew this, but we were still working on it, and Althea Raj beat us to the punch, and that's the way it works in journalism. But Mel, they also seem to think that in addition to the people who have signed onto this document, there are people like Sean Casey, who's not part of this.
Totally.
But agree,
Yep.
and will speak up, and I think they're kind of counting on that. Now, I don't know what the Prime Minister's office is going to do. They obviously have to listen to it and assess it and see what it is before they respond, but
Totally.
what do you think plays out next week?
Well, hearing Minister Miller and the two words that you kind of pulled out, Fred, are the same ones that I did. The fact that he mentioned entitled. You want to talk about entitled. The Liberal government's approach, particularly Cabinet and the Prime Minister's whole approach the last 2 years is let's just wait it out and see if people start liking us again. Like just this thought that if they just wait it out and they just wait for the Conservatives to make a mistake, everybody will come back to them. Everybody will love them again. Like it's not, let's change our communication tactics. It's not, our message isn't resonating. It's not, we're not meeting the moment. It's, just give it time and folks will come around. And the other thing, the sleepwalking, it seems like the Liberal government has been sleepwalking into giving Pierre Poilievre the win. They have no plan. They haven't been able to communicate anything. I know we've said it a few times, but why is the Prime Minister running? If that is the minister's remarks to his colleagues, to your point, that let's go back to, we're in a minority government. You can't piss people off like that. Like I can't imagine that those, 30 or so MPs will like hearing that. And I don't know that it's going to bring them on side. To me, what it would say to me is, I'm dismissing you. I don't think your concerns are real. I don't think what you're hearing is real. And, if you're not happy, well, tough. And that's not a position that the Liberal government can be in right now in the, context that we're in.
Greg, do you think they'll see it that way? And I do want to point out, we did have the 4 cabinet ministers this week say they're not running again. It's not connected with this. There's very individual and specific reasons there. So I don't want people to think those departures are fueling any of this. But so, Greg, how do you think people will take what Mark Miller had to say there? I mean, to me, it sounds like if you're going to do this, do what Sean Casey did. Put your name on it, put your face on it, and go public with it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I disagree with some of the wording that Mark Miller used around entitled. I mean, I think people would push back at Minister Miller and say, you've known Justin Trudeau a long time, you're in cabinet. You have access that we perceive that we don't. I'm not sure I entirely agree with Mel about sleepwalking through the last 2 years. I think, the pre-budget rollout, for example, was innovative. I think at another time when the Liberals were not dragging in the polls, it would have been, a huge help for any government to do something that way. The reality was polling showed a lot of Canadians liked the policies. They didn't like the top policymaker. So that should have been a time to pivot to something else. I can go back even further. When you have 8% inflation, that's the time to do a war room. That's a huge issue of affordability. They did a war room on Canada-U.S. relations about the free trade deal, but I think that was the one that I think perhaps caught them the most flat-footed, and it wasn't something that we had experienced in our lifetime, and it's the one that has, I think, really hurt Canadians the most. So I think that's kind of one of the big missed opportunities. I think right now, to your point, Sean Casey was, as I understand it, was called by a reporter and said, I'm going to go on the record. So there is a bit of a problem where, you're expecting somebody else to throw your snowballs. You make a good point about not all these cabinet ministers are resigning because they're upset. But I do think, we've always had to be prepared that they've been in government for a long time. There are other people that are going to announce that they're not reoffering. And I think on a case-by-case basis, that's going to be a big tell.
Right. So my information as of right now, Fred, is that at least amongst the cabinet, everyone who's not running has said has made it clear, right? You know, starting with O'Regan, going to Rodriguez, and now these four. I stand to be corrected and surprised, because that's true until it's not, right? But you need a happy backbench to fill those spots too.
Yeah, and look, they said a year ago when they reshuffled the cabinet that this was going to be the cabinet that likely goes in the next election, because there was a number of people leaving. So, you know, we can say it's not related to this coup to remove the leader that they're leaving, but you can't deny the 20-point deficit in the polls is playing in people's minds right now. And to Greg's point about a number of Liberals who don't want to run again in the backbench. But look, this is breaking out into something much bigger than I think PMO is anticipating, or nothing they've dealt with before. I can't remember actually any time that a governing prime minister had to deal with this type of a coup.
Chrétien Martin is the only thing I can think of
And
where
that was
someone in
because
power.
you had a leader.
Right?
You had Martin leading
Yes,
the
exactly,
charge, trying to
exactly.
replace him. Right now, there's just, you have to go. We don't even know what we're going to replace you with, and that, you know, not that I want to caution the Liberals in anything, but at the same time, you got to be careful
Other than
who
get a
are you
narrative.
replacing, because you know, this week we saw, I think Trudeau actually showed a bit of fight in him. I don't know who they replace him with that could actually campaign at his level. So that's going to be something they have to think of too.
It's interesting with the Chrétien Martin, you know, memories coming up. Eddie Goldenberg, who was the top advisor to Jean Chrétien, and by the way, ironically, fought to the bitter end to keep his prime minister in power, has written an opinion piece saying Justin Trudeau should go, right? And so you get this sort of stuff happening, Melanie, and you saw Dan Vandel saying it's young MPs who are nervous about their futures. Well, Sean Casey was born in 1963 and got elected under Michael Ignatieff. I don't know if that's the case there, but what do you make of the whole continuum of that stuff?
Right, and you said ironically, but who would know better that, you know, when it's your time to go, it's your time to go, and if you're going to go gracefully, like who would know better? So I thought that was interesting, and the comments around, you know, young MPs or not, every moment that we see here, and we saw this on Erskine Smith's MP podcast as well, but it's like the lack of any like ownership and lack of, okay, yeah, this hasn't been great, here's what we're going to do to make it better. Even in this like internal conversation of, we hear that you're frustrated, we hear that it's not fun on the doors, maybe it's not, you know, this is my future, I'm not going to get reelected again. But a lot of people, when they join politics because they really believe in their party. And if they're seeing that their party could be, you know, eviscerated in this next election, and they're thinking, how do we make sure that, and I know, you know, we hear it about the NDP all the time, this is going to be the death of the NDP, and that's not going to happen. But if you're looking to, how can we make sure that the Liberal Party is still relevant in this next election, those are legitimate conversations to have. And it doesn't necessarily mean, you know, it's somebody's, you know, worried about their own future. Like, those are healthy conversations to have. And the fact that they're so dismissive of them, and what it sounds like is a lot of these folks raise those concerns internally, and they raise them to the Prime Minister and his team, and nothing has changed. So now, you know, it's public now. So I don't know. I feel like it's very dismissive, and I can't see how it gets any better if it stays that way.
No, it was suggested to me that had they just had that summer caucus meeting that people were demanding after Toronto St. Paul's, they might have been able to vent a lot of this, and they could have avoided this. I have no idea. That's, you know,
Or come out with a plan after St. Paul's, right? They could have gone to ground, like I said, and come up with something and come into the August, September with, hey, this is our message, this is what we're doing, and they haven't done that.
Yeah, not a lot of visible signs
Every
of change.
difficult conversation is about hearing somebody out, and if you're not willing to hear them out.
Very good point. That's a very good point. But as Fred said, we did see that fire and fight from the Prime Minister today, or this week, at the foreign interference inquiry, because Justin Trudeau used his testimony at that inquiry to put a spotlight on Pierre Poilievre.
I have the names of a number of parliamentarians, former parliamentarians and/or candidates in the Conservative Party of Canada who are engaged or at high risk of, or for whom there is clear intelligence around foreign interference. And the decision by the leader of the Conservative Party to not get those classified briefings means that nobody in his party, not him, nobody in a position of power knows the names of these individuals and can take appropriate action.
Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has for months refused to get that security clearance and read top-secret reports on foreign intelligence, and he's still refusing even as Trudeau makes these allegations about the Conservative Party. There were already publicly shared findings that India and China meddled in multiple Conservative leadership races, including the race Poilievre won, but Conservatives are accusing Trudeau of lying under oath.
What we witnessed at the public inquiry this week was nothing more than well-rehearsed partisan smears by a failing prime minister who is facing rejection from Canadians from coast to coast and increasingly from his own Liberal Party, ones that are having letter-writing campaigns to oust him from his leadership.
Conservatives also say Poilievre won't get the security clearance because it would tie his hands and silence his attacks, something that national security experts say isn't true. That's the next topic for our party insiders, Greg McEachern, Fred Delory, and Melanie Richer. Fred, I want to start with you on this. Release the names is the demand from the Conservatives. National security experts say you do that, you break the law. The only way to do it is do it in Parliament, and then it's a gross violation of norms. I had Richard Fadden and Ward Elcock on the show this week saying that Poilievre's argument, you can brief his chief of staff, doesn't hold up. His saying there's other ways to deal with this, don't hold up. The experts all say he should get the briefing and do this. What's the reason for not getting the briefing and doing it?
Well, look, what he said is he does believe his hands will be tied. And if you listen to what Dick Fadden said when he was here on your show, he mentioned how, you can do a broad thing or you can pick different things. But if you go into certain elements, then you can't talk about those things.
Right. And
I believe Poilievre doesn't want to be encumbered in what he can say and talk about and questions he wants to ask.
So let me ask you about this. The issues pertaining specifically to the Conservative Party, the findings in NSI COP about the leadership races, and what the Prime Minister is saying about Conservative MPs. I have a hard time seeing a world where Pierre Poilievre stands up and says, Justin Trudeau, did you know about this in the Conservative leadership race? What are you going to do about it? That's for him to fix. He can take the actions there so he can get a narrow briefing to deal with the problems identified with his party, can he not? And still hammer the government to his heart's content.
Yeah, look, I don't know the full reasoning on all that and how he's determining on what kind of briefing he's going to take other than, what he said.
Okay, so Mel, is this becoming a political problem for Pierre Poilievre? Because all the other leaders who have been briefed in say, join the club. There's no reason for you not to, and you really should based on what we've read. How do you think this resonates?
I think for folks watching at home, they're seeing someone who, they're already worried, I think, or worried, maybe concerned about who Pierre Poilievre is. They're curious about him, but I think they are not worried. They're
anxious?
Anxious, maybe, yeah. Like they're not totally sure about him. So to see him in a moment where, I heard Jagmeet say a few times this week, like party or country over party, right? Like in these moments, this is where you put the partisan stuff aside and you are statesmanlike, you put your country above everything, and you do the hard things, whether they benefit you or not. And if I'm a regular person watching this week, it seems like he is unable to do that. He's unable to be that statesman person. And how the heck am I going to trust this person to lead our country and to have those difficult conversations and to make those difficult decisions? I don't totally understand, I obviously understand the attacks from the Prime Minister, and it was interesting to see him a little bit feistier this week. I don't know that that's a better approach, honestly, when it's, this subject is so important. Yeah. I don't know that that is necessarily any better on, again, this topic that we should be above board on. But I did agree with him on the substance of it. It makes zero sense to me why you wouldn't get this clearance, regardless on whether or not you want to take shots. I think, you have to rise above that and take your shots elsewhere. There's plenty of other things for you to take your shots at. I don't know that this is it.
Yeah, it's interesting. We have seen the Prime Minister and others say to the Conservatives, stop making allegations against people based on intelligence versus evidence. And then we kind of saw the same thing happen at the inquiry. And I know it's really, Greg, it's about the political argument on the security clearance. So when we had Ward Elcock and Richard Fadden on, I said to them, I want to do basically a Sesame Street segment, because when you watch Sesame Street, grown-ups would explain something to a Muppet and talk through the Muppet so the kids at home understood. Well, I was the Muppet, because I'm tired of the politicians telling me what's possible. I want the people who ran CSIS, and I can't find anyone who isn't a partisan who agrees with the Conservative position. All the people who work in national security say he needs to get the clearance to do this. So what did you make of the Prime Minister's move this week and sort of the politics of it all?
What's funny is in the initial lead up, he kind of qualified it and said, a political party. And then when there were follow-up questions, he did go for it. And it was one of those moments, David, as you know, that all of us that are in kind of this circle, you just had phones melting down in Ottawa when this happened. I mean, I think the challenge is when you hear MP Landsman and her leader smears or the Prime Minister's lying, how do they know that? They've not seen the evidence. They don't have the security clearance. The Conservative leader said his Chief of Staff has the security clearance. I don't see how that's relevant, because how can the Chief of Staff then convey information? Because as I understand the clearance, that's not the way it works. You're not given a security clearance so you can then broadcast it to someone else.
No.
Fred in the earlier segment referred to how well the Conservatives are doing in the polls, 20 points ahead sometimes. And it's going to tie the Conservative leader's hands from doing attacks. All he does is attack. So this is one less attack. And guess what? You're doing this because you're putting Canada first. He loves to verb the noun, so get the clearance. I think I'm finding Conservative friends finding this in conversations harder and harder to defend. I think it bubbled under for a long time. I think to your point about that we needed the Sesame Street explanation here, but I think as people start to look at the explanation and see it, it's harder and harder to defend somebody who says that they want to be Prime Minister not getting a basic part of the job, which is a security clearance.
Yeah, the Conservative defense on this and that, Ian Todd, the Chief of Staff, who I do not know, but I've heard is a very good guy and has been a very good Chief of Staff and servant to governments in the past. He has a security clearance where he can get information, and the Conservatives say he's never been told anything about bad actors maybe in the caucus. But what Fadden and Elcock said is, he has no control over candidates. He has no control over MPs. He's an employee of the guy who does. So they would never brief him because he has no power. And the point of a threat reduction briefing is that the person can take action to reduce the threat. He can't take that action, and he can't tell the person who can, because the person who can doesn't have the clearance. So their argument is that it's not an effective way to deal with it.
I watched that interview that you did with them, and when they said that, I was a bit struck by it, because what does the leader, powers does the leader have to deal with
You
candidates?
can't run for us. I mean,
Chief can say that too. The president of the party can say that too. None of them actually have the authority to remove it.
So, but the Chief of Staff to the OLO, the opposition leader's office, can say a candidate can't run, like Jenny Byrne and Pierre Poilievre are going to be
with a candidate that's serious that they can bring to the National Council.
But they can't bring it to the National Council because the National Council isn't security cleared.
The leader can't either, right?
No,
the leader doesn't have authority. There's a misconception that a number of years ago, the Reform Act passed in the House of Commons that everyone seems to have forgotten. Leaders don't sign nomination papers anymore in Canada. At the
well, in
level.
the Conservative Party, they do in the Liberal Party.
No, they don't. The federal level, the official agent does. It's not done by the leader.
Okay, but I mean,
just saying, but to say, right. I listened to the interview. The directors said that because the chief couldn't take action, chiefs can take action. Chiefs of staff are, Eddie Golenberg was a very powerful chief. There's other chiefs that can do things. So it's just doesn't make sense.
But from the CISA, okay, but fine. But from the CISA's perspective, they would not bring the intelligence to an employee of a leader who is not cleared. That's kind of what they said, right? So, like, I know we've throughout this inquiry heard of Jeremy Broadhurst briefing the Prime Minister about what they were told about Handong and Don Valley North. Broadhurst had security clearance. The Prime Minister had security clearance. They can have that conversation. If Ian Todd, in a similar scenario, wants to go to Pierre Poilievre, he's not allowed to tell him anything. So, like, why would you brief him? Is essentially the argument. And this is where it kind of falls down, right?
But he did have briefings on this, right? And
not on these particular things. They wouldn't have told him about the candidate. He had briefings, and the candidate issues were never raised. And the Prime Minister said because it's on a need-to-know basis. And if the view of the intelligence services is the chief can't act because the leader isn't cleared, then the chief doesn't need to know. That's the
right.
So this is the loop we're caught in on a complicated issue, right?
And here's the problem: there's no actual mechanism to do anything with this. Even if you're telling the leader, you're giving them hearsay from whatever the evidence is. We have a major issue where there's no, there seems to be nothing coming forth of how do we fix this. Where we need institutions that can talk to each other and actually put forth ways to deal with this type of stuff. Because right now, it's all just hearsay and stuff being passed around.
Right, but if you get top secret security clearance, you can have a conversation with the other leaders about what you all know, right, Mel? Like this is the thing in that it's release the names, get the clearance. This is the binary we're in. There's massive issues there in terms of national security, parliamentary privilege, and the law, and there's no moving past it.
Right, and like fair maybe technically, but I think if a leader doesn't want a candidate to run, the leader gets to decide that the candidate doesn't get to run, right?
Yeah.
Like there are mechanisms
Not in our
there.
party. I wish
Well,
that was.
Come on, man. Come on. Come on, Fred.
And we've talked about the Conservatives, how they like screwed up races, right? And it blew back on them. So we've actually sat around this table and we've talked about actual races and candidates that are run under Pierre Poilievre where they've meddled in and it caused a lot of friction and they ended up getting what they wanted, right? So there is ways, there are
Arpan Canna says hello, right? He suddenly became the candidate in Oxford because they wanted him to be the candidate.
Exactly. Like there are things you can do and there are internal processes that you can review and you can make sure to like agree with you that systems need to be reformed. And the more this becomes a partisan thing, the more this becomes a, I know these names and you're not getting your security clearance, the more it becomes a game, the more Canadians are distrustful of the process and distrust the information that they're hearing, and the less we're getting down the path of let's fix these systems to protect our democracy, protect all of that, protect from foreign interference. But I want to make it, I think, that you can have those conversations internally and you can start fixing your own processes and the processes of the party to protect from that a little bit with some guidance from these advisors and from the folks that they're speaking to. So,
But Greg, here we are, I don't know, a couple of years into this, and we have the Prime Minister now weaponizing national security issues in a way he said should not be weaponized with what we saw there. A party whose leadership races may have been compromised, and the leader refuses to read in on that. Allegations of WeChat disinformation campaigns and busloads of students going into a single riding, maybe some money circulating amongst candidates, so we don't know if it ever got there in the 2019 election. This is what the inquiry is talking about. Meanwhile, we have India being accused of extraterritorial assassination plots in Canada and the United States, and that is not the focus of the inquiry. We're talking about internal party processes. It feels to me that because of the politics around this issue, we've ended up with an inquiry that deals with what the politicians wanted rather than what diaspora communities and the threat posed by bad actors really requires.
Yeah, and it's hard not to feel when we had the breaking news on Monday, for example, on Thanksgiving Monday, that the foreign interference inquiry is almost a rearview mirror, and we have things happening day to day, which is ultimately more important. The number of conservative leading columnists, for example, that sided with India, the reaction to this very muted from the conservative leader at the beginning, and so I kind of when I hear that the Prime Minister was partisan. Excuse me if I roll my eyes a little bit about why the Liberals are held to a different standard on that than someone else. And to Fred's point, I don't think anyone's going to buy that Pierre Poilievre, if he doesn't want someone to be a candidate, they don't get to run. We know this, Sabrina Maddow, there's an issue in Halifax where a candidate was running and another candidate was named. We talked about Oxford. The Conservative leadership, the fact that the Conservative leader does not want to get a security clearance and is showing no interest in the allegations that have surfaced is a big problem. And if the Liberals could get up off the mat a little bit, that's probably something that whether it's partisan or not, they should be pressing because it is concerning.
Yeah, and look, we're out of time, we got to go, but just if you're writing an opinion piece saying Canada is somehow to blame for the murder of people on Canadian soil, or that the RCMP did what they did to distract from the Prime Minister's testimony, which we now know he did not want to distract from, maybe pick up the phone, call some people and check your assumptions, because there's enough information out there to tell you that that is not how this is going. The cops were worried people are going to get killed, and that's why they did what they did. Greg McEachern, Fred Delory, Melanie Richer. A week from now, who knows what we'll be talking about, but we'll see you next week.